guys, welcome back to Belle's Books. I'm Carly and I'm here today to do my very belated November and December wrap up. Now, I haven't got many books to show you because I've been using the library a lot recently and using Scribd, which is an Audible service. So I have been taking my books back to the library, so I've hardly got any physical copies to hold up and show you. So I've got my notebook with all my notes in about what I read in November and December. I've got a cup of tea because I'm really cold today. And let's crack on. So November was non-fiction November. And I tried to read as much non-fiction as I could. And I was reading one in October that I carried through to November. So I finished that in November. When did I finish it? Finished that early in November, so that was on the 4th. And that was The Five by Hallie Rubenhold. Now, everyone's been talking about this. I know it's had loads of hype on BookTube, and it is well deserved because, seriously, it was one of my favourite books of the year, which I'll come on to because I'm going to film that next. So The Five, as you probably know, is about the 5 women who were killed by Jack the Ripper. But it is not about him and it's not about their deaths, it's about the women. Because not much was known about them. No one bothered to do any research into them, even at the time of their deaths. So Hallie Rubenhold does this amazing thing of going back, looking at historical records, so birth and death certificates, anything that she can get hold of that is about these women that can help us understand what their lives were like. So these women were all working class women, and she discusses everything about their lives from their birth through to their death, but she doesn't talk about their death. She goes right up to the night of their death, but she doesn't go into like the grim details of what happened to them. She doesn't talk about Jack the Ripper. It's all about these women and their lives, and I bloody love that. I found it absolutely fascinating because I love learning about Victorian London anyway. It's all set in London, obviously. But one of these women was from Sweden, so it starts in Sweden where she was born and talks about her upbringing on a farm there. So she goes through each of these women and discusses the social history of where they were living, what at the time, what happened to them, and goes into how they got into the point where they were walking the streets of London at night to become prey for Jack the Ripper. So their names were, I've written them down because it was a long time ago I read it, Marianne, or Polly Nichols as she was known, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly. So each of these sections looks at their lives, and a lot of them, I mean, they're all very different for how they started off, but a lot of them end up in the same way. Poverty, ending up in the workhouse, and alcoholism. Because, as she points out, the lot of women was to be dependent on a man. Obviously, women didn't get paid as much as men. They couldn't work all the time because they were bearing children endlessly. Some of them were in abusive relationships. Some of them, their husbands cheated on them and walked out and left them, or they left their husbands because they'd gone off with another woman. And their choices were limited. They had no choice but to, if they were not supported by a man, they ended up in the workhouse. And when you're that low, what happens? You turn to drink. And a lot of them just turned to drink. And they were then ended up walking the streets in drunken stupor or asleep. To be honest, I think a lot of Jack the Ripper's victims were asleep when he found them. And it is heartbreaking because you get to know these women and you're kind of rooting for them. I think the second one, Annie Chapman, she had a really promising life. Her husband was a coach driver for this posh dude and she lived on an estate. But I think a lot of her children died, and so she was struggling with the grief of her children dying. And again turned to alcoholism, and you're kind of rooting for her, go, no Annie, don't do it, but you know how it's going to end. And it's just, the narrative is so good to get you that involved, and it almost kind of it doesn't read like a novel, but that you're so gripped by it. I was just enthralled by this book. Absolutely loved it. I love the social history aspect, and I really love going to London, visiting London. like as a tourist, and I was always kind of intrigued by the Jack the Ripper stories before, and thought, oh, I'd quite like to go on a Jack the Ripper tour. Now I don't. Now I want to go and visit the streets where these women lived, and even though it's completely different now, obviously, I want to go to the places where they lived and moved around. I'm not interested in this, whoever he was, Jack the Ripper, and seeing the grim places where these women were found. I want to see where they lived and where they worked and moved about. And it's just so, it blew me away. It was just so good. If you haven't read it yet, please do go and read it. Fascinating. Next, hang on, wait a minute, got to go back a few pages. I read This House is Haunted by John Boyne. Again, a library book, so I don't have it to hold up to you. This was fun. I read it around, it was just after Halloween, at the beginning of November. It was just a fun kind of spooky ghost story about a governess who goes to live in this house, Rubenhold, I think it's called. Classic. I think it's just like a bit of a spoof on of Turn of the Screw. So this governess turns up to look after these two eerie children, and all the previous governesses before her have died in mysterious circumstances, and there's strange things going on at Rubenhold. And it was fun and kind of spooky, but not really kind of overly scary, because it's almost like a parody of a ghost story. So it's not like majorly frightening. It's just kind of, because it gets quite supernatural quite early on. You're like, all right. But I really liked it. I thought it was a fun read. It's good for Halloween time. It gets a bit bonkers at the end and goes off on a crazy tangent. So nothing like Turn of the Screw, where you're left thinking, what just happened there? You know exactly what happens. It's like, oh, all of the things. But it was super fun. And I've only just come across John Boyne this year. I read The Heart's Invisible Furies earlier on, and I really enjoyed it. So I want to get to more of his work. And that was a lovely read for this time of year. So yes, if you're into daft, scary stories, pick it up. Oh, wait, I've lost my page. Hang on, let's have a sip of tea. I've got some turmeric tea. Like I said, I'm very cold. I'm trying to get to warm up. Next, oh, I do have this one to hold up. Next, I read for a cosy read, as you may have seen on my cozy reading night, Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. I'm not going to talk about this because everyone knows what it is, and it was just a lovely cozy read. I'm doing I'm rereading the series again, just because I feel like going for some nice, comforting stories. So yeah, this was lovely, and I'm not going to say much more about this. Everyone knows it. It's just nice. It's nice to read at this time of year. Oh, then I listened to Diary of a Bookseller by Sean I can't say his name. Bythell? I probably got that wrong. I listened to it on audio, and this is basically just the diary of Sean, who owns a bookshop in Wigtown in Scotland, which is a place that I have never been and I really want to go. I've since looked up his bookshop on Facebook. It looks amazing. So this is his diary that he kept of a year, of like number of customers that come in, number of orders he gets online, and it's him talking about his day-to-day life, his crazy customers, his crazy employees, and how difficult it is to run an independent bookshop when you are faced with a challenge of competing with the giant of Amazon. And yeah, just like the day-to-day passing of, you know, what happens as people come in, and he talks about how he acquires books. He goes to like house clearances and stuff, and how much he pays for those books compared with like the customers come in and they're just like, can't you do me a better price on this? And it's already like £1.50. So it's really funny, and because he's I think he kind of has this kind of grumpy persona, so some customers are quite put off by him, but I just thought it was hilarious, and I really want to read or hopefully listen to his sequel, which is I think called The Confessions of a Bookseller, which is out now. So I really liked that. It was a good read. Then I read Black Country by Liz Berry, which is a poetry collection. Again, it was a library book and I've taken it back. I'm trying to read a lot more poetry. So I picked this up from my library because it was recommended by Jen Campbell and I really enjoyed it. It's written, a lot of it is written in dialect, a bit like Jen's book. So it's in, I think it's Midlands dialect because Liz Berry is from Dudley. So it's written kind of in accent, which I thought I couldn't really deal with, but actually I think I really like it because even though I can't do the accent speaking it, you can kind of hear it in your head. So when I was reading those poems, I was hearing them in dialect. And the poems are about where she's from, so the Black Country, her home, her connection with home and landscape and language, like that accent is very prevalent. And the poems were just beautiful. They're just beautifully written. And I'm not great at appraising poetry, but I just really loved it. And there was one poem, oh, hang on, I've written it down, called, what was it called? Boston Fiddle, which I think was about her, like she references her grandma's cooking and like the language around food that they use and food particular to that area or that person and time of, you know, the things her grandmother used to cook for her, things like that. And that really resonated with me. And from that, I went actually to a poetry workshop with Jen Campbell and I wrote a poem, not really a response poem, but kind of in a similar vein to how I felt about being in my nan's kitchen and the way that she used to like pummel pastry and stuff like that. So that poetry collection kind of really resonated with me in terms of connection to the landscape and connection to people, particularly, you know, like family members that you really love and as you're kind of changing and growing up. So yeah, it was just beautiful. I would highly recommend that collection. Then I read, for my book club, I do have this one as well. I read Wide Sargasso Sea by Rhys, which is a reread for me. Because I read this years ago and I picked it for my book club. So this was really nice to reread actually, because like I said, it's been a long time since I read it. It is kind of a prequel to Jane Eyre. Now Jane Eyre I absolutely bloody loved when I read that as well. And then I read this and it was a game changer and it made me question everything that I had kind of taken for granted when I read Jane Eyre. So this is the story of Antoinette Cosway, who is the first wife of Mr. Rochester. It tells her story as she grows up in Jamaica on a plantation, and then is kind of her marriage to Rochester is arranged. She doesn't really want it, but it happens. And then it just kind of, it discusses her madness as is portrayed in Jane Eyre, when actually what's happened to her is she's just kind of suffered at the hands of men who've controlled her life. And I didn't really like Rochester in Jane Eyre. I thought he was a bit of a twat. But then in this book, I really bloody hated him. And it just made me kind of think, what the hell? Why did we not question that there was a mad woman in the attic? As in, what happened to this poor woman? So it gives a voice to Antoinette Cosway. And it tells her story. And if you haven't read it, please do, because it's just amazing. And Rhys, I love her writing anyway. It's beautiful. And it's only a short little book. Like it's 200, not even 200 pages probably. Read it. Go read it, because it will blow your mind. Particularly if you like Jane Eyre. Okay. Then I read How to Fail by Elizabeth Day. I listened to this on audio. Now, I know this is well loved on BookTube. And I have mixed feelings on it. I was going to DNF it when I started listening to it. I didn't gel with her writing style. I found it a bit too kind of schmaltzy, and you know, I just didn't like it. And the first few chapters I was like, oh, I'm really struggling with this. It was How to Fail. So she talks about instances in her life where she's failed and what she's learned from it, which is a premise I'm on board with. But, and I really like her podcast. I'm going to say that because I have been listening to a podcast where she interviews other people where they talk about their failures and what they've learned from it. Great. But I don't know, I just think because she's coming from a very privileged position, her failures didn't really seem like massive failures. Like she talked about when she failed a test at school, and where she failed at work because she's a journalist and she's got this amazing career where she travels around the world writing things for newspapers and magazines, and she failed at work because she put herself in a dangerous situation interviewing some dude that kills badgers. Yeah, and I don't know, I struggled with it a bit. I wasn't that impressed. I know everyone else loves it, so I know I'm in a minority here. The end picked it up for me. There was, I think, the last few, hang on, I wrote these down, the last few chapters, How to Fail at Babies and Anger and Success, I think. I liked those sections. And maybe it would have been different if I'd actually read a physical copy. But I don't know. I might give it another go. If I do, I'll actually read the book rather than listen to it on audio. Yeah, I just didn't gel with it. So I guess it wasn't my jam. So yeah, maybe I'll give it another go this year. Then I moved on to another non-fiction, which was, oh no, back up. Hang on. I read another poetry collection, which was Witch by Rebecca Tamás. My throat is killing me. I need some more tea. Witch by Rebecca Tamás. Oh, sorry. This is a poetry collection which oh God, is about witchcraft, feminism, the state of the environment, the damage we're doing to the environment, misogyny, how witches were treated. It's just everything I love. Some of it did go a little bit over my head, and there are some poems where I'm like, I don't know what's going on here. But as I've said before about how I approach poetry, I'm just reading it and going, what do I get from this poem? And like, I've started now, when I have a poetry collection that's mine, and if you can see, I start to mark it up. So I write notes about things that it makes me think as I'm reading it. I think that's the best way. So I really love this poetry collection. Like I say, some of it was a bit out there and I didn't really know what she was talking about. But a lot of it I really loved. And it's kind of poems and spells. And I'll show you my favourite one. Because it was the opening poem. Wait, oh God, I should have got this ready. All of the pages right at the beginning. It's a penis hex, which I just think is amazing. I've sent this to quite a few of my friends. Bloody loved it. And it's definitely one that I will come back to and read again. So yes, and also it's another poetry collection that has spurred me on to carry on with my poetry. So I have written kind of response poems to this collection. So would highly recommend this. Chuck that over there. Next, then I read another fiction, which was Sex, Power, Money by Sara Pascoe, and I really liked this. So, Sara Pascoe looks at our sexual, as humans, our sexual behaviour in relation to our genetic predisposition. So, I found this fascinating. So, she goes back and looks at like biological and evolutionary practices that have caused us to act in the way that we do around sex and power. So like jealousy. So she looks at how jealousy works in relation to kind of the way that humans would pair bond. So because for the benefit of the species, we need to reproduce. We would form pair bonds with the best or most suitable partner that would then enable us to produce a strong child. So she was talking about like how jealousy works in terms of harking back to that pair bonding, which I just found fascinating. And there were some things in this book that I felt uncomfortable with, but I really appreciated the way that she talked us through the science of it. Again, I listened to this on audio and she read it, which I really liked. I really liked her voice. I think she's ever so funny, and she did a good balance between like the science of it and acknowledging that that's not a reason for that's not like an excuse for the bad things that happen today, like domestic abuse and rape and all the horrible stuff. So I found it really fascinating. And again, I think this is another one that I want to come back to. I want to read it in physical form because it raised so many questions and it really made me think differently about issues that I am kind of like, I've got it set in my mind how I feel about things in terms of feminist responses to things like domestic violence and the way that men treat women. So I loved that book for that reason, and I just found it fascinating. Would highly recommend it, actually. I haven't read any of her other works. I know she wrote a book called Animal, which I bought for my friend Emma for Christmas. So, oh my god, this video is getting so long. Rein it in, Carly. So, if you've read any of her other books, let me know in the comments down below, because I'd be intrigued to hear what you think of Animal as well. All right, then, hang on, we're into December now. So then I read Names for the Sea by Sarah Moss. This was recommended by Jen Campbell again and Lauren from Lauren and the Books. I really liked this. They really raved about it, and I said Lauren reads it every year in December. I didn't like it as much as I thought I would, but I still really enjoyed it. So this is a book about Sarah's time living in Iceland. She moves there for a teaching post in the university, and it's a discussion of the cultural differences between Iceland and the UK. Things that you just don't really think about, like the fact that it's difficult to get fruit and vegetables there because by the time it's imported they've gone mouldy and they can't grow stuff there because it's so cold, like in the winter. So she found it really difficult just to get certain foods that she was so used to having, and just weird stuff, like it's really shameful over there. Well, probably not anymore, but at the time she was there, it's really shameful to have second-hand goods. So she was looking around because she just moved there for like second-hand furniture and clothes, and people in Iceland were like, what the hell are you doing? No one buys second-hand things. You just throw stuff out when it's finished, which seems incredibly wasteful and bonkers. And she couldn't get her head around it. So yeah, just crazy things like that, things you don't think about in terms of cultural differences. What else was it? And oh yeah, and everyone knits, which I love. Everyone knits in Iceland, so they all knit their own jumpers and stuff, and people just knit as they like travel to work, and like we would read or students were knitting in her classroom, which I just thought was excellent. So it was a really interesting look at like Icelandic life, and she talks about folklore a little bit, which was my favourite part actually. She talks about the little people, you know how I think it's been in the news about how they'll not build a road where there's supposedly a fairy dwelling in Iceland, which I find fascinating. And like there was a little bit on the Christmas folklore, like the Yule lads coming down from the mountain, which was amazing. I love hearing about stuff like that. So it's a really nice book to read in December, so I'm glad I picked it up then. And then are we into, yes, we're fully into December. Then I listened on audio to the Christmas Chronicles by Nigel Slater, which seems a bit weird because you would think it's a recipe book. It is a recipe book. And I haven't seen the physical copy, so I don't know. I'm assuming like there's more detail in the recipes, but in the audiobook, it's more like a memoir. He talks a little bit about his life, his memories of Christmas, what he does at Christmas, his own traditions. And I love Nigel Slater. I love the way he writes. I love the way he speaks. It's narrated by him, so I love hearing his voice. Mostly because when my dad was alive, my dad used to come around on Sundays and we would watch Nigel Slater together. And so that has a nice it's a nice feeling for me to listen to Nigel Slater's voice because it just reminds me of being with my dad. So I listened to that and it was beautiful, and his writing is like sumptuous and indulgent, and he just like, he's obviously very privileged now where he is because he earns lots of money and stuff. But he talks about his childhood and what Christmases were like for him as a child, and the recipes that his mum used to make, and it's just so cozy and lovely, and it was perfect for Christmas, obviously. But I loved it so much that when it got to the end, I just couldn't bear not hearing his voice, so I just started playing it all over again. So I listened to it twice, back to back, in December. And yeah, so I would highly recommend that for Christmas. Listening to an audio is just an absolute delight. Bloody loved it. And I'm going to do the same in this December. I'm going to listen to it again and hopefully get a physical copy because some of the recipes in there were like amazing. Right, we're nearly there, guys. Bear with me. I know this video is super long. The last book I read in December was a fiction, and it was The Confessions of Frannie Langton by Sarah Collins. I really love this. This is a mystery. So you start off with Frannie Langton, who is accused of killing her master and mistress. Sorry, my throat is killing me. I think I'm getting ill. She's accused of killing her master and mistress because she wakes up covered in blood, asleep next to her dead mistress. And she doesn't know what happened, so she has no recollection of that night. So it's kind of working backwards, trying to work out what actually happened. Did she kill her? She starts off telling her story of when she was a slave in Jamaica and the things that used to go on in the plantation. So I found this fascinating. Obviously, it's fiction, but it's based on real accounts of white men who used to do experiments on their slaves. I did not know this, and it's made me feel really sick and horrible, but they would cut them open and try and understand what being black meant. It's just horrendous. So Frannie's original owner did this with his slaves, and she's talking about that and him writing a book on it. And then she gets given as a gift to this dude in London. So she travels to London, who is kind of in the same vein, writing all this nonsense stuff about what it means to be black, and like he knows. And she lives as a servant in this house and then develops a relationship with the mistress, which I really loved. I love a queer love story. And that was a really good part of the book. I enjoyed that a lot. So because she's in love with her mistress, she thinks, well, I can't have killed her, because why would I? Because I loved her. And it just tells of her kind of experience living in that house and what happens, and like all the other servants don't really like her very much because they're very judgmental. Oh god, it's so windy outside, it just sounded like something fell over. And yeah, at the end you kind of get to know what happened, but it's a super fun, well, it's a really good mystery. It kept me engaged throughout. I really love actually the writing style took me a few chapters to get into, because first of all I was like, oh, I'm struggling with this a bit, but then when I got into it I really enjoyed it. She does write beautifully, but it just took me a while to get into it. And yeah, really good book, loved it, I would highly recommend. now I think that's it. I think that's my wrap up done. I'm sorry this has been so long. Quick, cut it short. I'll be back with you very soon doing my favourite books of 2019 and then my reading goals for 2020. I hope you're all well and you're keeping warm and having like hot water bottles and nice teas to keep you snug when it's cold and windy outside. Talk to me in the comments below. Tell me if you've read any of these books, what you think of them. Am I being unfair about Elizabeth Day's How to Fail? Talk to me. Tell me how you felt about them and what you're reading at the moment, and I will see you very soon in another video. Bye!